In this image, look at this huge pink-colored area. Today, it is referred to as Russia. Before 1991, there were 15 more countries in Russia. These are depicted in various colors on this map and share a border with Russia. All of them were collectively referred to as the USSR prior to 1991. And then this enormous nation fell apart. The consequences of the incident are still being felt more than 30 years later. So how did a nation that had the power to shape every aspect of the 20th century, be it history, economics, ideology, or technology, suddenly disintegrate? It was due to the fact that the USSR at the time was home to more than 100 different kinds of communities and sects. Here are some more facts you should know about the USSR. It covered almost 1/6 of the planet's land. It had conquered Hitler. It was engaged in a Cold War with America. It was way ahead in nuclear weapons technology, and it was crucial to the revolutions in Cuba and Vietnam. The USSR had also sent the world's first satellite into space. The first human being to go into space was also from the USSR. Aside from this, the USSR was the most advanced nation in that era in terms of sports, the arts, literature, science, and technology. Nevertheless, on Christmas Eve in 1991, the biggest nation in the world collapsed. Similar to how India was divided in 1947, which gave an identity to Pakistan. In today's video, we will learn the complete history of the USSR and how it fell apart. Why did it fall apart? How many countries did it break into? What were the reasons behind it? We will know more in detail. So, stay with us till the end of the video. And make sure you like, subscribe, and press the bell icon to stay updated with more historical videos in English. Let us begin with the question of why it is called the USSR or how it was formed. USSR stands for Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, where Soviet means the governing council or the one who makes rules or regulations. Socialist means the people of socialist ideology who support a political or economic philosophy, and republic means a state in which supreme power is held by the people. Hence, the USSR was a group of 15 republics that followed the rules and regulations made by them with socialist ideology. When the First World War was going on in 1917, the king of the Russian Empire was Tsar Nicholas. The whole of the USSR was under Tsar Nicholas's reign. But in the year 1917, there was a Bolshevik revolution in Russia, which is also called the October Revolution or Russian Revolution, whose leader was Lenin. Under Lenin's leadership, the Russian Empire ended, and the throne of their king Tsar Nicholas's reign was overthrown. But from 1917 until 1922, there was a civil war in this whole region, in which all the communist parties took part. But by 1922, Lenin had calmed everything down, united all these countries, established the USSR, and became its leader. Take a look at this image. These 15 countries together formed the USSR. It is called Soviet in Russian. All these countries had their own Soviets, like parliaments. As with Kazakhstan having its own Soviet Union and Ukraine having its own Soviet Union, all the countries had their own Soviet Union. Together, those unions used to function like a parliament. Lenin's view of the USSR was very clear. He wanted to transform all these different regions into one. However, there were around 100 different communities, out of which the Russian community was the largest. Moreover, there were some people from the non-Russian communities as well, like the people of the Turkish community from Turkmenistan, people from the Kyrgyz community of Kyrgyzstan, and more. Lenin believed that in a few years, all these people from different communities would blend into one and help make the USSR a better country. Actually, Lenin wanted to make the USSR a democratic country, just like America and India, but before he could do it, Lenin died in the year 1924. And Joseph Stalin came to power in the USSR. But Stalin turned out to be a dictator, a worse dictator than Hitler. Stalin also formed a parliament in Moscow and named it the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union. And this is where dictatorship began in the USSR. Stalin introduced one-party rule in the USSR. That meant only one party would do everything, the Communist Party, and no other party would be or could be formed. After becoming the Supreme Soviet in Moscow, Stalin took over the power of the whole USSR. Nothing could have happened in the USSR without Stalin's permission. All decisions related to the economy, foreign policy, and more went to Stalin's Communist Party. Stalin had a small committee in which a few selected people collectively chose the leader of the USSR or took decisions for the whole of the USSR, which is called Politburo. In this image, the person in the middle is Stalin, and the rest are his committee members. Basically, these people had started ruling the USSR. But during this period, the USSR also successfully introduced good things like the 5 Years Plan. In 1928, the USSR was the first in the world to introduce a 5-year plan policy. Seeing their success, the rest of the countries across the world also followed. India too was one of the followers. And in most of the democratic countries of the world, even today, this 5-year policy is present. Coming back to Stalin, the dictator whose Communist Party gradually took control over the politics, economy, and people of the USSR, anyone who opposed him was caught and sent to Gulag. Take a look at this image. This is Gulag, where opponents of Stalin's regime were imprisoned. They were forced to work day and night, tortured, and then killed. Now, take a look at this map. All the marked locations are gulags. You may be surprised to hear that Stalin murdered a far greater number of people within his own nation than Hitler killed the Jews in the gas chambers. That is why some historians call Stalin a worse dictator than Hitler. Stalin not only killed his opponents but also his army officers and his own ministers, whoever raised their voices against him or opposed his views. And by the time Stalin died in 1953, he had imprisoned about 1,80,00,000 people of the USSR in Gulag, in which lakhs of people were put to death. This is how Stalin enslaved the USSR and its people. And after Stalin's death in 1953, all the following leaders of the USSR worked the same way until 1985. Nikita Khrushchev was the first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. Then Leonid Brezhnev replaced Khrushchev in 1964, and he also died in 1982. And then Yuri Andropov came, but within 2 years of his leadership, he also died in 1984. And Konstantin Chernenko became president, but he too died in 1985. And finally, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. Everyone followed Stalin's path, except Mikhail Gorbachev. We will talk about Mikhail Gorbachev in a while. Firstly, let us examine the actions that the USSR's Communist Party took that raised the possibility of the USSR collapsing. The first reason was dictatorship, and we did talk about how Stalin or his later dictators had oppressed the citizens of the USSR. The second significant reason was the space race. After World War II, the USSR and the USA were the only countries in the world to compete for the title of superpower. A competition started between them as to who would be the first to send a satellite into space, and the USSR won. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first satellite in history, into space. Then the USSR also sent the first human being to space. The world's first human to go to space was Yuri Gagarin of the USSR, who was born in 1961. Then, the USSR also won by sending the first animal, a dog named Laika of the USSR, to space for the first time. That means the USSR was much ahead of America in everything. But in their space missions, the USSR spent a lot of money and invested billions of rubles. But what did the USSR achieve by going into space first? It just got their names registered. And that's not a significant find like gold or silver. That proves the USSR overspent in their quest to go to space. The third reason was the investment in armor and nuclear weapons. You must have heard about the nuclear bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan. The USSR was afraid of America's nuclear power and couldn't ignore the possibility of a nuclear attack by the USA. Therefore, to protect itself and its citizens, the USSR aggressively started making nuclear weapons. At that time, there was a competition between the USSR and America to make the most nuclear weapons. And together, both countries had about 26,000 nuclear weapons. The question is, why did these two countries make so many weapons? Well, the answer is simple. Let's take an example. If America wants to attack the USSR, where will it attack? At the base, where all the nuclear weapons would have been kept. That would blow up all the USSR's nuclear bombs. Sounds disastrous, right? So, to escape such a possibility and keep nuclear armor options in some place to launch an attack, the weapons were distributed and deployed on planes, submarines, and a lot of places on the ground. Apart from this, both countries were heavily investing to strengthen their armies and hoard defense vehicles such as tanks, submarines, and other vehicles. In this armor competition, the USSR gave equal competition to America, but the USSR also had to pay a heavy price. The economy of the USSR was declining, and their deposits were slowly depleting. The fourth reason on our list is the Cold War between the two countries. Both of them were aspiring to become superpowers in the world. The USSR was a communist country, and America was a democratic country. The USSR wanted to spread communism throughout the world, and America wanted to spread democracy. That's why the USSR was helping communist countries of that time, like North Korea, China, Cuba, and Vietnam. It had offered them weapons, technology, materials, other essential things, and even money. And the USSR was offering this to the countries that had communist regimes during the Cold War. The Cold War was not a war of just 1 or 2 years, it lasted for about 45 years. It started immediately after World War II, in 1945, and continued until 1991. By helping other communist countries for such a long time, the USSR suffered a lot, its economy was in decline. In the war between Vietnam and America, Vietnam won with the support of the USSR, but the USSR spent a lot of money on it. The fifth reason was the hellish bureaucracy. In such a huge country as the USSR, bureaucracy consumed and spread across the Soviet Union due to dictatorship. This bureaucracy was prevalent in all the communities of the USSR. It implied that each person had to go through a drawn-out process involving paper, stamp paper, or self-identification to get anything done. Such strict rules and laws made the USSR a difficult country. Just as it is in North Korea today, so it was in the USSR. The USSR's thwarted economy is the sixth reason on our list. Karl Marx, a German, served as an inspiration for the USSR's economic philosophy, in which the mutual transactions of production, partition, and mutual processing of resources were all considered to belong to society. On the other hand, the Communist Party in the USSR owned all the businesses, factories, or any industry. The public could only work in these Communist Party's owned industries instead of starting one of their own. People could not do their own business. Therefore, a large part of the population of the USSR was employed in agriculture and factories. But in America, people could work for themselves, you could own and run your own factory. But there was a ban on doing so in the USSR, due to which the USSR lagged behind America in terms of economy. And by the 1980s, the USSR's economy and GDP had dipped by 50% in comparison to that of America's. The seventh reason on our list is the Soviet-Afghan War. As I told you, the communist government of the USSR supported the rest of the communist countries in the world. In this sense, Afghanistan was also a communist country, but in Afghanistan there was a group of mujahideen that went against the Afghan Communist Party, and the Mujahideen group started a war with the Afghan government. That is why the USSR also jumped into the war to help the Communist Party in Afghanistan. This war started in 1979, when on one side were the Mujahideen and on the other side were the communist governments of Afghanistan and the USSR. This war continued for 10 years and ended in 1989, but in this war, about 15,000 soldiers of the USSR were martyred or more than 50,000 were injured. This is why the image of the USSR got damaged in front of the world. Considering it was the biggest country in the world, it had the biggest army, yet even a small group like Mujahideen could not be defeated. This greatly tarnished the image of the USSR, so much so that it affected its economy as well. The eighth reason is a lack of better education. There is a saying that education is a weapon that is sharper than the blade of a sword. Despite such strict dictatorship in the USSR, around 100,000 people were educated by 1980. Gradually, the external restrictions on people were reduced. This made people aware of the world. Then educated people started forming social groups, which became influential, and gradually people became aware of and understood how citizens are treated across the world in comparison to the treatment offered to USSR citizens. So, these were all the main reasons that caused the collapse of the USSR's economy. This image depicts the declining trend of the USSR's economy from 1928 to 1987. In the beginning, in 1928, it was the best, and at the end, in the decade of 1980, it reached its worst phase. Moreover, in the same period, in the year 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the USSR, which made him the first president of the USSR. He wanted to offer freedom to his people. However, his one mistake led to the downfall of the whole game plan. Let us learn what exactly happened. With the arrival of Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985, everything started playing out. He saw the declining economy of the USSR and was aspiring to revive it and make some changes in economic policy. Hence, Mikhail Gorbachev imposed two new policies. One was perestroika, and the second was the glasnost policy. These are Russian words. Under the glasnost policy, the people of the USSR got the power of speech and writing. They could say whatever they wanted to say, the media would write whatever they wished to, and no one would be put in jail. In the second policy, perestroika, the government introduced elections. The USSR was previously headed by a leader chosen by the Communist Party. But after the introduction of this policy, two leaders of the Communist Party were able to compete to be elected. That meant, as a citizen, you could vote for your favorite leader. Under this policy, even foreign investment was introduced in the USSR. That meant big companies could open factories in the USSR and open their business ventures, which would also open avenues of employment for the citizens. Before this policy, the people of the USSR could not do their own business, but thanks to this policy, citizens were able to do private businesses. Mikhail Gorbachev instituted these two policies with the intention of restoring the USSR to its former status as a developed nation. Instead, this policy led to the collapse of the USSR. Let's learn what happened in 1989. The year 1989 is known as the Year of Revolution because this year, the world saw a revolution across the world. In 1989, three countries neighboring the USSR, Poland, Bulgaria, and Romania, had communist governments. They were not part of the USSR. But the governments of these countries followed the USSR's government regime. The governments of these countries were, in a way, puppets of the USSR, which took all its orders from Moscow. But Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of perestroika or glasnost caused revolutions in Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria to remove the puppet-like governments. Moreover, these revolutions to remove communist governments started spreading in other countries as well, like Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and Hungary. In 1991, communist governments were toppled in all countries except Romania. That was because of its dictator, Nicolae Ceausescu. Sorry for the wrong pronunciation. Nicolae had put his army in front of the Romanian citizens and killed them. Later, the people of Romania killed Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife on live TV. So, the puppet governments of Poland, Romania, Hungary, East Germany, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and Czechoslovakia that took orders from Moscow to run their countries were all overthrown. During this time, Mikhail Gorbachev could have sent the USSR army to these countries like before, but he refused. Earlier, the USSR made no mistake. Previously, during a revolution to topple the government in Hungary in 1956, the USSR army was sent to end the revolution, and many people in Hungary were killed. But this time, Mikhail Gorbachev did not do that, so all these countries got freedom. Earlier, Germany was divided into East and West Germany. But it was after the revolution that the Berlin Wall was brought down in November 1989, and the two Germanys became one again. At that time, America's President, George H.W. Bush, also announced the end of America's Cold War with the USSR because communist governments were overthrown in many European countries. Many countries in Eastern Europe got their freedom, but the USSR still existed. And then the remaining 15 republics in the USSR also started demanding freedom for their respective countries. The first three regions to demand a separate country were Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They claimed their countries were free before World War II and the USSR had forcibly overtook them and merged into the USSR. Now they should be allowed to regain their freedom. Then, in 1991, the remaining countries of the USSR also declared themselves independent. All the countries conducted elections, in which all the communist governments lost. During this period, in the month of August 1991, a historic event took place, which is called the August coup. The power of the USSR was in the hands of Mikhail Gorbachev. In the month of August 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev went to Crimea. Over here. And the remaining leaders of the Communist Party of the USSR were against the idea of freeing the republics and wanted the USSR not to be disintegrated and kept as it is. The rest of the leaders, including the former defense minister and the vice president, believed that Mikhail Gorbachev's policies were the reason behind the disintegration of the USSR. That is why, according to them, Mikhail Gorbachev had to be removed from power. This is why the other big leaders got Mikhail Gorbachev detained in Crimea. News spread in the USSR that Mikhail Gorbachev is ill, hence, an emergency has been imposed and the remaining leaders will together run the country. There were a total of 8 leaders involved in the conspiracy who also belonged to the Communist Party of the USSR. He forcibly declared an emergency in the USSR. That's why the people of the USSR got angry and revolted on the streets. In big cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, millions of people descended on the streets. The communist government called the USSR army on August 19 to scare the people back to their respective homes. However, many dignified army personnel denied their support and did not agree to go against their own people, and the August coup failed. So, the army did come, but in small numbers. Here are some images of this coup that you can see. People climbed the tanks, they didn't want any violence but freedom. Now take a look at this image. The man with a paper in his hand is Boris Yeltsin. This image is a prominent one in the political history of the world. Boris Yeltsin was one of the leaders of the Communist Party. He was born in Russia. On August 19, Boris Yeltsin joined the people on the streets, and he gave a powerful speech to the people. He started by mentioning that the USSR was huge and that governing it cost a lot. That's why Russia should be freed from the USSR. This burden should not fall on Russia, since the other USSR nations are small and underdeveloped. It is in Russia's best interest to free itself from governing the republics, and the people's demand of breaking the USSR and freeing all the countries will be heard and fulfilled, hence, we will not impose this emergency. And along with this, he also resigned from the Communist Party. The demands of Boris Yeltsin and the people were aligned. He emerged as a great leader in a very short time. Russia, after the collapse of the USSR, conducted elections in which Boris Yeltsin won or became the first president of Russia. After all this, the president of the USSR, Mikhail Gorbachev, returned to Moscow to witness that the power of the USSR was no more and Boris Yeltsin was leading as the president of Russia. He was left with nothing to claim on his return. After Boris Yeltsin came to power, he accelerated the disintegration of the USSR. On December 8, 1991, an agreement was signed, named the Belarus Accords. This is the original image from that time. He is Boris Yeltsin. In this agreement, the three biggest countries of the USSR, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, signed an agreement to become separate countries, and that's how the USSR was disintegrated. Mikhail Gorbachev was witnessing everything. The USSR had collapsed, and the country he was leading as president was no longer there. This is why Mikhail Gorbachev, on December 21st, called the presidents of all the countries independent from the USSR and made an Alma-Ata declaration. You can see this in this image. Mikhail Gorbachev signed this declaration and disclosed it to all the countries. Then, on December 25th, Mikhail Gorbachev also resigned from the post of USSR president. So, this is how the USSR was disintegrated, or, you can say, this is how the Soviet Union was separated. Now let's talk about what the situation was in the 15 countries that were formed after partition. The USSR was born, and these 15 countries became Russia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. The decade of 1990 was very bad for all these countries. Because after partition, a government comes to power that doesn't have any funds or resources to lead or serve the public. Everything starts from scratch. Due to this, the GDP of all these countries slumped. Due to severe unemployment, there was a surge in poverty. To survive and fulfill their basic needs, people indulged in crime. Corruption also increased in these countries. The poor became poorer while the rich became richer. The decade of 1990 was a bad period for all these countries. But after the year 2000, everything went well, or all the countries went on their own paths. Now, let's see what changes the collapse of the USSR brings about in the world. The race to become a superpower in the world ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union, as the USA became a superpower. It established its dominance over the entire world after the collapse of the USSR. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Cold War also ended. And the communism that existed in the countries of Western Europe also got over. And the countries established themselves as democratic. And the third world countries that the USSR used to help with economic, military, or technical support also ended, thereby starting a bad phase for them. And the biggest thing is that no one should rule by oppressing citizens or enslaving them, and this whole event heavily influenced democracy all over the world. This is the story of the making or breaking of the USSR. I hope you learned something from this video. If you did and would like to learn more, then do like, subscribe, and press the bell icon to stay tuned. See you very soon for another video about world history. Thank you.